in certain portions of the work of God, we must really put on our thinking caps and really be able to think through what it is that's taking place in front of us and ask ourselves why things are taking place. What is driving the challenge to the work of God? Because with the work of God, there will always be challenges. And this chapter that we're going to look at this morning in Nehemiah chapter 6 addresses those challenges and the necessity of examining things in light of those challenges that come to us. And so as we're looking at Nehemiah this year, rebuilding the fallen walls, and thinking of each chapter as a stone with an emphasis that we need to put back into the wall around the church, we've been looking at, in chapter 1, the importance of supplication and prayer. And prayer is something that we see an extended prayer in chapter 1, but we're going to run into it twice in this chapter, and we've run into it quite a few times throughout the study of the book itself. In chapter 2, there's the importance of preparation, knowing what it is that God wants us to accomplish, and then how we're going to do it. That moves into chapter 3, coordination, moving, and getting things in the right direction. And then in chapters 4 through 6, we've been looking at the external pressures that are inevitable. External in chapter 4. Then you have internal pressures that we saw last month in chapter 5. They were mistreating one another. And then when we come back to chapter 6, we see external pressures. And then there's one small internal pressure that rears its head at the end of the chapter. And so, as we think through this, we have to figure out how to walk through these particular issues and how we face these challenges. And it is in this chapter that the building of the wall actually reaches its completion. Okay? It actually reaches its completion. So, what's interesting is this, and it's something we have to understand. In the midst of work, as it is progressing and hostility increases, if you stay true to your task, if you remember what you're doing and for whom you are doing it, you can finish your task in the midst of challenge and adversity. But if you give up, if you distract yourself with all of the adversity, you will never finish the task in front of you. And so what we're learning from Nehemiah is to keep the task and the one for whom we do the task central, and then deal with the annoyances as they come along. And so as we think about this chapter this morning, I want us to look at this chapter under 4 different headings and the different challenges that they face in each one of these. And so as we think about them together, number 1, the first challenge that they face, it comes again from the outside, is the challenge of compromise. It's the challenge of compromise. Now, first of all, what we have is the enemies are getting desperate. The enemies of God have reached a point of desperation. That's what he says in chapter 6 and verse 1. When Sanballat and Tobiah and Geshem the Arab and the rest of our enemies heard that I had built the wall and there was no breach left in it, although up to that time I had not set up the doors and the gates. So the walls are finished, they're completed. He's got to hang the gates, but their window, in essence, is closing. If they want to stop the progress, they don't want Jerusalem to have its walls completed, because that means then they can't get protection, and then these enemies can still wreak havoc on them and control them the way they had in the past. And so what they do, when the walls are being completed and the gates are not yet hung, that window of opportunity is quickly closing. And so the persecution, the difficulties will come as progress starts to be made, and they're going to continue to come up until the project is completed. Because the individuals, and a lot of times these pressures are about power struggles. And individuals, when they sense that their power is being stripped from them, begin to absolutely lose their minds. And they do, and resort to all manner of ungodliness. And so that's what we have here, is a sense of desperation. And so, but they cloak their desperation, they cloak their intentions under the idea of deceit. Look what they say. Sanballat and Geshem sent to me, saying, "Come, let us meet together in the plain of Ono." Let's get together. And so you can kind of see what they're saying. Let's get together and talk this out, right? We've had our differences in the past, but let's let bygones be bygones, right? Let's just come together and we're going to talk about it. Now, Ono, the location of it is not absolutely certain. Some people view it as being on the western shore near Philistia. Some people have it about 7 miles south of Joppa, which was a seaport city. Remember, Jonah went there to flee from the presence of the Lord. Other individuals placed it in various locations, but we're looking somewhere between 20 and 30 miles from the city of Jerusalem. And so they're drawing him out away from the city, away from the protection, away from the work. You see, now we want to sit down and talk. We tried to use physical force. We tried to use all these other things to get you to stop the work. And so that didn't work. So what we want to do now is let's get together and have a meeting. By the way, meetings many times are the death of work. They are the death of work. And sometimes meetings are the individual seeking to micromanage and to halt the details. And so, but Nehemiah sniffs it out very early, and he says, now wait a minute. I know they're intending to do me harm. That's the way verse 2 ends. How does he know that? Well, we've had all of this time over the last almost 2 months, and you haven't once said you want to sit down and talk to me. Now, I've seen you say you're going to invade the people, and I've seen you sneer at the people that I'm serving. I've seen you do all manner of things, but the one thing you have not ever wanted to do is sit down and talk and try and build a civil relationship. Why at this point should I believe that you're trying to do that? And furthermore, if you want to talk, why is it that you're setting the terms of a location that is almost 30 miles away from this place of safety for me? Nehemiah said, I know what you're trying to do. You're intending to do me harm. At the very least, they were going to kidnap him. At the highest, they were going to kill him. It was an ambush, and he knew it. I'm not walking into an ambush. But that's what they were trying to do. And then when you come to verse 3, you see his response as he sniffs it out. And he says, I sent messengers to them saying, I'm doing a work that I cannot come down. I'm doing a great work and I cannot come down. Why should the work stop while I leave it and come down to you? Wait a minute. You want me to come down to a meeting 30 miles away? It's going to take me it's going to take me a day or two. It's going to cost me at least a couple of days of work to travel there to have the meeting and to travel back if you don't kill me. In that whole time, what is stopping? Work. I'm doing a great work. What you see in Nehemiah is an intense focus. I don't have time to talk. I have time to work. We're not going to talk. We've had our differences. You know exactly what's going on. You know what you intend by this. I know what you intend by this. I have a job to do, and I plan on doing my job. And so he will not let them distract him from what it is that's taking place. Nothing is going to stop him from fulfilling this mission. And they keep going forward in this. In verse 4, they sent to me 4 times in this way, and I answered them in the same manner. No, let's come back. Let's have the meeting. No. Let's have the meeting. No. Let's have the meeting. What part of this are you not understanding? No. Because I know what's going on. See, this is about compromise. They guise it under, as they did in the days of Ezra, we seek your God as you do. We're trying to work through, we didn't really like it on the front end that you were doing this, but, we do have to deal with each other, so let's learn how to get along. Nehemiah said, that's not what you're about. And I know it, and you know it. And his suspicions are obviously confirmed under the next heading. Then they move to the area of coercion. Let's see if we can coerce him into a meeting. In verse 5 and verses 5 through 7, this is the coercion. And in the same way, Sanballat for the 5th time sent his servant to me with a letter in hand, open in his hand. And so instead of sending sealed letters, now it's an open letter to draw attention and so people can see what's going on. And it is written, it is reported that the nations, that Geshem also says it, that you and the Jews intend to rebel and that you are rebuilding the wall according to the reports that you wish to become their king. And that you also have set up prophets to proclaim concerning you in Jerusalem, there is a king in Judah and the king will hear these reports. So now come together and let us take counsel together. So what they're doing is resorting to an old tactic. In Ezra chapter 4, this is how they got the rebuilding of the temple stopped. Okay? Now it was a generation previous to them, but it's the same tactic. They wrote to the king and said, these people have been rebellious from the beginning. That's what they're doing now in rebuilding the temple, so you need to make them stop. And that's exactly what happened. And so they're trying, and so he's threatening him. If you don't, then I will send a letter to the king. And by the way, they took this very seriously, especially since just a few years previous to this, they had had a rebellion that they had to put down in this same region. And so, he's trying to coerce him and threaten him and force him into submission. So, either you come meet with us or we're going to send this letter. Listen, when you do that, all you're doing is confirming to me what I already believed about you. If this meeting really was about getting along, why are you sending messengers, and now why are you threatening me if I don't come to the meeting? You see, we're going to strong-arm you. And for some people who live by the iron rule, that is, that might makes right, they can't understand a person that cannot be coerced. They cannot understand it. Their philosophy, everybody has a weak point, and we're going to exploit it. And those people, when they run up against a Nehemiah, they don't know what to do. They don't know what to do when they run up against a principled person who is more concerned with what is right than being right. And that's why they're not going to get anywhere with Nehemiah. But they're trying to coerce him. And Nehemiah looks them in the face, beginning in verse 8, and says, "Then I sent to him, saying, no such things as you say have been done. For you are inventing them out of your own mind. You're not telling the truth. This is nothing but a lie. For they all wanted to frighten us. All you're trying to do is scare us. This is nothing but psychological warfare. That's all this is." And so Nehemiah looks at them, and listen, this letter has teeth. If he sends it off, Nehemiah is going to be investigated at the very least. But Nehemiah says what? So be it. What you're saying about me is not true. Investigate me all you would like. I have nothing to hide. I haven't said this, I haven't done this, and all you're doing is making this up as you go along. So go ahead. And then he turns his attention to the Lord and says in this prayer, "But now, O God, strengthen my hands. Help me to stay focused. Help me not to lose what it is that's almost complete. Help me in this situation not to bow to coercion." Then number 3, beginning in verse 10, we'll call this a crime because they're trying to get him to commit a crime. And we'll see that unfold here in just a moment. First of all, you have a plan that's set out, and they use an old prophet in the city to do that. It says, "Now I went into the house of Shimei, the son of Delaiah, the son of Methabel, who was confined to his home, and he said, 'Let us meet together in the house of God within the temple. Let us close the doors of the temple, for they are coming to kill you, and they are coming to kill you by night.'" So, they use someone who is a prophet. They know that Nehemiah will respect, and they buy him, they pay him off, and say to Nehemiah, you need to tell Nehemiah that we've got a plan and we're coming to kill him. Get him to hide in the temple or the holy place. Now, what's the problem with Nehemiah hiding in the holy place? He has no right to be there. He's not a priest. He doesn't have a right to go through those doors. And so here you have a prophet of God encouraging the leader of God to break the law of God. And I love Nehemiah's response because Nehemiah is so cognizant of his leadership and the responsibilities that he has as a leader. He operates on this principle in verse 11. He says this, "But I said, should such a man as I run away? And what man such as I could go into the temple and live? I will not go in." First of all, should such a man as I run away? I'm the leader of Israel. If I run, if I tuck my tail and run, what will that tell other people? What will that communicate to the people that I have encouraged just 2 chapters previous to fight because our God will fight for us? It will communicate to them that fighting is something that they should do, but it's beyond me. I should be able to hide and protect my life. I shouldn't have to exhibit courage and faithfulness in the midst of difficulty. Should such a man as I flee? And furthermore, what have I done wrong? What have I done wrong?
And then he says this, in the second question, he said, should such a man as I go into the temple and live? Because the person who went as an unauthorized individual into the temple, there was a sentence of death placed upon them. Numbers 18 and verse 7. King Uzziah, much later, or a few generations previous to this, was a good king, and he was lifted up with pride, and he went into the temple to try and make an offering, and God hit him with leprosy, and he died as a leper. Because he dared to walk into the temple and to do that which he had no right to do. Nehemiah said, you're trying to get me to come in and to commit a crime and to sin. But you're doing it under the guise of what? Oh, this is what you need to do to protect yourself. Nehemiah says, I might protect my physical life, but I'll destroy everything I've spent my life building. He's operating under the principle, it's better for me to lose my physical life than it is to destroy and go back what I've spent my whole life building. My life has stood for something. Now, some people will never understand that because their lives have never stood for a thing. Their lives have never stood for a single, solitary thing. All they have ever done with their life is going along because they don't want to be different, and they don't want to have anyone to look at them differently, and they don't want anyone to judge them, and they don't want... And it's like I was told a million times as I was a kid, even a dead fish can float down the stream. Going along with people just because it's what people are doing, a dead fish can do that. God gave you a brain, use it. Think through it and have some moral toughness to know the difference between right and wrong and to do what is right and to reject what is wrong. Now again, for some people, what Nehemiah is doing, they can't understand it because they themselves don't live lives of principle. First of all, I'm the leader. I can't run. And number two, even if I go in there to save my life, I sin. And then I cost everything I built my life upon. And that's exactly what he's about to see in verses 12 and 13. Here's the point. And I understood and saw that God had not sent him, but he had pronounced this prophecy against me because of Tobiah and Sanballat and hired him. Now watch this. For this purpose he was hired, that I should be afraid and act in this way and sin, and so they could give me a bad name in order to taunt me. They were baiting me to sin. Because when it was done, they were going to be able to look at the people I was leading and say, look at there. Look at your leader. So brave, but yet he's hiding. Look at your leader. He's encouraged you and held your feet to the fire about how you were treating your brethren, and he himself walked into the temple of God against the law of God in order to save himself. They were baiting him to sin. And people say, when you get into these situations, and by the way, don't believe for a second that these situations don't exist in the church where people will bait you to sin. I've got an ugly laundry list of them that I've seen and heard through the years of people who were baited to sin. People say, how do you respond in those moments to when someone baits you to sin? The same way you do to every other sin. You say no. You don't prepare yourself for some extraordinary moment. You do to sin what you always do to sin. You just say no to it. Nehemiah put it together later, that's what was happening. But when it happened, he simply said, no, this is what the law of God says. I don't break the law of God. And later he was able to look back on perspective and say, they were baiting me. And so then he turns again to prayer. And he says to God, remember Tobiah and Sanballat, oh my God, according to all these things that they did. And the prophetess Noadiah which we don't know anything about her, and the rest of the prophets who wanted to make me afraid. So there are apparently quite a few people involved in this conspiracy. Quite a few prophets who were trying to tell him to do this. Nehemiah said, don't let them get away with it. But notice that Nehemiah doesn't take it on himself to exact justice on them. He simply looks at God and says, God, you handle them. They did me wrong, but you handle them. That's not my job. This is Romans 12. This is other places. We don't exact vengeance. That's God's job. And as one individual once said, come Judgment Day, when God begins to exact vengeance, you don't want to be found behind enemy lines. What did he mean? You don't want to be found in the enemy camp exacting vengeance on your enemy. Why? Because God is going to scorch the enemy lines. And if you're over there exacting justice, you're going to get scorched with it. Quit trying to do God's job. But then we come back around full circle, and this compromise business keeps coming back up. But first of all, we have some very good news that things are completed in verse 15. It says, so the wall was finished on the 25th day of the month Elul in 52 days, so roughly 7.5 weeks, as some individuals have dated it in particular as October the 2nd, 445 BC. So in those 52 days, everything was completed. That which was unthinkable, which they told them in the very beginning you could not do, he did it in record time. And then there were consequences that became to the nations. In verse 16, when all our enemies heard it, and all the nations around us were afraid and fell greatly in their own esteem, for they perceived that the work had been accomplished with the help of our God. You see, the task was so legitimate, the task was so tremendous, that the only thing that could explain this ragtag group of people making such progress was that God was behind it. The only thing that made sense. And therefore the enemies looked at it and said, this is not good. Because if you're concerned with power and you have a nation, you have a group of people who serve God, and God is driving those people and making those people to prosper and succeed, he's cutting away from you, and when you're power hungry, that's difficult. Now, what I love about this text is this, and that is that you take a group of people who are really they're just not spectacular people. They're not really, they weren't super educated. They weren't super skilled. They weren't super rich. They were captives that had been allowed to return back to their homelands, and they were poor. And yet God used them to accomplish a task that thought unthinkable. Now, here's the reason why I like that. Is because this is the point that Paul makes in 1 Corinthians chapter 1. When he says, look into your calling, look at the people. In essence, as he says to the church at Corinth, I want you to look at the people assembled with you in the assembly today. How many people in your assembly are known for who are known for wisdom? They're off the charts with their smarts. How many people in your assembly are titans of industry? How many people in your assembly that if they died today would be known by the world for the rest of existence? None. There's nothing extraordinary about that group of people. And can I be as bold to say there's nothing extraordinary about us either? We're not industrial titans. We're not intellectual scholars. We're not people in the top 10 wealthiest people, the top 100 wealthiest people in America. There's something wrong. Listen, if people can look at what the church does and say, oh, well, that makes sense because, you've got all these things lined up and they've got all these resources. That's no good. What the church does has to not make sense because they look at a group of people and go, I don't really know how they did that. They're really not all impressive. Now, you see, for some of us, that's insulting. You called us unimpressive. Well, you know what? At the end of the day, by worldly standards, we are. But the reason why that's good is because God uses unimpressive people to impress people with His greatness. That's the way God has always worked. Go through the great leaders of faith throughout Scripture. There was nothing extraordinarily spectacular about them. They were just ordinary. And yet now they're held up with such high views, not because of what they did, but because of what God did in and through them. And so when people try and make excuses, but we can't do that because, we don't have resources or we don't have, I'm not, or people say I can't be involved in that because I'm not talented in that, I'm not really gifted in that particular area. Well, good. That's actually the thing that makes you most qualified to serve in that area. But he accomplished it anyway. And when it was accomplished, the people looked at it and said, God is with this group of people. Then this compromise comes in again through correspondence. They start sending letters back and forth to Tobiah. Moreover, in those days, the nobles of Judah sent many letters to Tobiah, and Tobiah's letters came to them. For many of the men in Judah were bound by an oath to them, or bound by an oath to him, probably commercially. They had some interchanges, and then there's some intermarriage that takes place. He was the son-in-law of Shechaniah, and the son of Era, and his son Jehohanan had taken the daughter of Meshullam, the daughter of Berechiah, his wife. And also they spoke of his good deeds in my presence and reported my words to him, and Tobiah sent letters to make me afraid. And so even after they go through all this, after all he's put them through, you've got people still in the city that are faithful to Tobiah. And not only that, they're committing treason because they're sending information from Nehemiah's meetings to Tobiah. That's treason. It's betraying national secrets. It's treason. Oh, and by the way, they're speaking positively of Tobiah in my presence, saying to Nehemiah, Nehemiah, Tobiah's just misunderstood. He's really not all that bad a guy. And Nehemiah's saying, where have you been? From the very beginning, all he has done is make our life difficult. He doesn't care about you. Why do you think that he cares about you? Because he doesn't. And so there's this constant spin. Compromise comes right back around. So as we think about how this applies to us, I want to close with three things. First of all, in the work of God, there can never be compromise. At the beginning of the chapter and at the end of the chapter, they're trying to get Nehemiah to compromise. Listen, there are some things over which there can be no compromise. Some things are just right. And if there's going to be compromise, so to speak, it's not going to be because we leave what is right and meet you halfway in the middle of what is wrong. It will only be when we meet together on what is right. Jesus refused to compromise. In Matthew 15, when he talked about and he took to task the Pharisees for their hand-washing rituals, and he talked about what comes out of the man defiles the man, the disciples came to him and said, Lord, didn't you know that the Pharisees were offended by what you said? What did Jesus say? Oh, well, I didn't mean to do that. Go get them and bring them back here. He said, leave them alone. They're blind guides. And if the blind lead the blind, both will fall into the ditch. They're in error. They're wrong. And I'm not going to change what I say just because it will make them like me. What about in John chapter 6? When the text says, beginning in verse 60 down through 71 at the end of the chapter, when a large group of people have been following Jesus, and it says when they heard this, many of them turned away and walked with Jesus no more. That is, a large group of people that had been following Jesus for days, they left him. What he said they found offensive. And what did Jesus do? Oh, wait, I didn't mean that. I don't really want to lose all of you. We can meet in the middle, right? They walked away, and he looked at the 12 and he said, do you also want to go away? What was he saying? I don't change. God does not change so that we will come to him. He says, you come to me and I will change you. God is not the problem, we are. And there is no middle ground in what is wrong. And so when it comes to this, we have to understand this as well. In the work of God, as Paul would say in Galatians 2, 4, and 5, as some individuals tried to come in and spy out their liberty that was in Christ, what did he say? We didn't give subjection to them. We didn't give them any place for a single hour. Why? So that the truth of the gospel might be preserved for you. What was the implication? If we met them halfway, we would have lost the gospel for you. We would have compromised the gospel to let them have their way. There are some things, and it's not about not liking people. It's not about being ugly to people. It's about right and wrong. And as an old axiom, one of my teachers used to write on the board all the time, it is always right to do right, and it is always wrong to do wrong. It is never right to do wrong, and it is never wrong to do right. It cannot be compromised. Number 2, never submit to coercion. Jesus refused it. Nehemiah refuses it here. In John 19, you remember what Pilate said when he came back to examine it again? He said, don't you know I have the power to put you to death? And Jesus said, you wouldn't have any power unless I gave it to you. You're not going to strong-arm me. That's what he's saying. And for us, there can't be a bowing to pressure. In Daniel chapter 3, when those 3 young men were brought in front of Nebuchadnezzar, not because they had held a protest and they made a big scene, but because somebody saw them and turned them in. And Nehemiah gives them a chance to reconsider. What do they say? They said, look, the God that we serve is able to deliver us. He's able to deliver us. But even if he doesn't, you need to understand something. We're not bowing down to that image. Now notice what they did. They resigned themselves to the sovereignty of God. You can't strong-arm us with this furnace. This image that you've created is nothing but metal. We will not bow down to it and treat it as God because it isn't God. And if that costs us something, so be it. And so there is that sense of a refusal to submit to coercion. And then number 3, never yield your credibility. Never yield your credibility. Jesus never one time yielded his credibility, even though it could have won him some things in John chapter 8. He said, if I said I don't know God, I would become a liar. But I do know God. What did Jesus say in Matthew 5 and verse 13 when he talked about the salt of the earth, and he called us the salt of the earth? What did he say? If the salt loses its saltiness, what is it good for? Nothing. It is thenceforth good for nothing but to be cast out and trodden underfoot by men. When we lose our name and we lose our reputation, we lose it. And it's incredibly difficult to get it back. We have to guard a reputation of holiness. Not lying, not disingenuousness, but guarding holiness. Because when we live a life consistent with the message we preach, it gives us a hearing in the ears of people. But when we live a life inconsistent with the message we preach, it's really hard for people to listen to us. It's really hard. And that's what Nehemiah shows us. Stay consistent with what God has given in holiness. So Nehemiah has fulfilled the work of God that he gave to him in the midst of difficulty. Jesus fulfilled the work of God. And the question for us is, are we going to fulfill the work of God given to us in the midst of difficulty? Do we have the moral toughness and the desire for what is right? To do what is right and to always be faithful to the Lord. If not a New Testament Christian, we need to come to know him and to be involved in that good work. With a penitent faith that confesses Jesus to be immersed in water for the forgiveness of our sins. Or as New Testament Christians, we have not been faithful to the work of God. We have hindered and harmed and hampered the work of God because we have submitted to coercion or peer pressure, or we have given in areas that we know good and well we were wrong when we gave in, and we gave in anyway. Then it's time to make that right. And if we can help you do that in a public way or in a private way, let us know as we stand and sing this song.